When Jill and I were in the process of moving, one of the things that neither of us talked about, but both of us knew was an eventuality, and that was cleaning out our basement. Sometimes she would bring it up in subtleties, sometimes I would hint around about it. Neither of us talked about it out loud, neither of us volunteered to do anything about it. And so as we're moving and in the process of moving, the basement was one of the last things that we tackled. And if we could, you could just cue the horror music in the background. Both of us knew that we had to tackle it, but man, was it going to be a nightmare. Well, eventually we could not put it off any longer, and we began to talk about getting onto the basement. I said, well, why don't I get up tomorrow and I'll begin. You can get the kids over to mom and dad's and you can come over and you can help me. She said, perfect. We'll tackle it together. So we did that. I got up the next morning. We had our coffee. Jill took the kids over to my parents', which takes about 10 minutes there, 10 minutes back. So 20 minutes. When she came back, she came down into the basements, and there I stood, paralyzed as I looked around at all of the stuff that needed to be moved. How long was I standing there? Well, I was not in the basement when Jill left. I went down in the basement soon after she left, and I was standing there having done nothing 20 minutes later. I saw the pile here and the pile there. This was the stuff that was to go to the yard sale that we were going to have, and this is the stuff that went to Goodwill, and this is the baby stuff, and this was even after Jill had completely organized it. She said, babe, what's going on? And I said, I am so overwhelmed by all the moving parts here. I said, I just don't know where to begin. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations and circumstances that we just don't know what to do in regards to the next step forward. Now, maybe for you, you're a big picture person, and so the details, like for me, can sometimes get overwhelming. And maybe you're a detail person like Jill, and you're able to get right in there and get your hands dirty, and you know what needs to be done. But with all the different details, sometimes you disconnect the detail from the big picture. And whichever one of those might describe you, the question that we have to ask ourselves as Christians in this time, whether you've lost sight of the big picture because you're involved in all the details, or maybe all of the details have caused you to come to a grinding halt in your life. What is the clear step forward for us at Calvary and for us as individual Christians? Well, Paul knows this about us, and Paul gives us a clear path forward in 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1, the clear path forward is we got to ask God for help. The reality is Christians that continue with clarity ask God for his helping grace, and God always gives it. As we ask God for help, what are we asking him help for? We're asking him for the help that we need to be on mission with him and to make disciples. So in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, he says, take what you have learned from me and pass it on to faithful men and women who can then pass it on to somebody else. And we're not talking here about just making disciples. We're talking about making discipleship or disciple makers. This has always been our mission and calling. But it is absolutely necessary to remember this when we get overwhelmed, both by the big picture or the details, or we get caught up in the various details of our lives. I believe right now, the siren call to make disciples can easily get shouted down by the other fears and anxieties that have crept into our daily life. The truth of the matter is, our work has not changed, but maybe God has a plan to revive our passion, our purpose, and our work of making disciples. So, what does it take to make a disciple? If you're not already there, take your Bibles, turn to 2 Timothy chapter 2. After Paul says to Timothy, take what you've learned and pass it on to men and women who can pass it on to others, Paul gives 3 illustrations on how to make disciples. And the first illustration that he gives is that of a soldier. What does it take to make disciples? Well, what does it take to be a soldier? And the answer to that is that the soldier remains single-minded in his pursuit of the mission. Paul says, he does not get himself entangled with civilian affairs. He can be involved in them. He just can't be involved in them more than what is appropriate to keep him from remaining on mission. Sometimes pastors do this with their family. Sometimes pastors will be on mission to pastor and forget their family, and yet at other times, sometimes pastors can begin to not see their family connected with the mission, and they get entangled. Well, we can do that in a wide variety of areas. Our education, our employment. We don't have to leave these things, but we have to see them as integral parts of how we fulfill our mission. We don't quit our job, unless he's calling you to the mission field. But we see our job as interwoven, or the field in which we live out our mission. So how do we make disciples? Well, what makes a good soldier? Single-minded devotion to the mission. The second is this. How do we make disciples? What does it take to make a disciple? Well, what does it take to be a professional athlete? And he says there that an athlete has an ambition to win, an ambition to compete. He disciplines himself. She commits herself to training and dieting. Why? Because her eye is on the prize. And we talked about how the reward is, well done, thou good and faithful servant. But an athlete can train and never compete. And so it's not just that we need to have ambition, but there needs to be a getting in the game dynamic. You can be a Christian and not be a disciple maker. And you can be a Christian and get to heaven and not hear, well done, thou good and faithful servant. So we want to make disciples like a soldier or like an athlete. Today, we're asking the question, what does it take to be a disciple? And the question that we're asking today is, what does it take to be a good farmer? So I'm going to pull today on all of my experience in backyard gardening. No, but even if we don't know the integral aspects of farming, I think it's probably not hard, as we know a farmer or we've seen testimonials of farmers, about the crossover between farming and making disciples. Look at verse 6 in 2 Timothy chapter 2. Paul says this: it is the hard-working farmer who ought to have the first share of the crops. We want to look just at 2 things together today. What does it mean to be a hard-working farmer or a hard-working disciple maker? And the second thing we want to ask is, what does it mean that the disciple maker ought to have the first share of the crops? And that's an exciting one. Let's look first at the work ethic of the farmer. It says here that it is the hard-working farmer who ought to have the first share of the crops. The word hard-working here in the Greek is kapos, and it means to exert tremendous effort. It means to be so involved in the process that at the end of the day, you fall into bed. Kapos has this idea of a man or a woman who has expended such tremendous energy that they feel like they've been beaten or whipped. How many times have you said this? Man, I just feel whipped. I am so tired. Or you could say, man, I am beat. Well, have I been beaten physically? No. But the exhaustion from the effort, and that could be from anything really, from soldiering to an athletic a trainer, the training of an athlete, and certainly a farmer would fall into this category as well. John MacArthur makes an interesting point about kopos, about the hardworking farmer. He says that this word does not stress the amount of work produced, but rather the effort that it is given. He says, a man's reward from God is proportional to the excellence of his ministry and the effort he puts into it. You know, as we think about making disciples, okay, and we think about what it means to be a hard-working disciple maker, not everybody is going to have the same results. In fact, 1 Corinthians chapter 3 tells us, Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gives the increase. In other words, in disciple making, God is responsible for the production. He's responsible for the results. And if you think about it, just like in farming. So the emphasis here is not on what the farmer produces, but it's the amount of effort that he expends in the farming process. You and I are going to produce at different speeds, levels. We're going to produce differently based on gifts of the Spirit. So our production doesn't have to be the same. But what the Lord weighs is not what we produce, but the effort that we expend for Him and for others. All three of my kids, I can ask them to do the same thing. I'm not so concerned about them each performing at the same level. They can't. They have age differences, they have ability differences, they have intellectual differences, they have body type differences, they have personality differences. They're not producing at the same level. But you know what I want to see? I want to see the same amount of effort, right? When I ask them to do something, when we're working hard together, I want to see them putting their full self into it. That's what pleases me as the dad. Really, to be honest with you, 8 years old, 4 years old, and 4 years old, there's not a lot of production that's really taking place. But I love seeing the work ethic. I love seeing the straining and the sweating. Because you know what it says to me? It says to me, I care about what Dad wants. And I care about working with him. I want to encourage you today, if you're 80 years old and you are largely in a wheelchair, or you are 8 years old and you're not completely sure yet about all the things that it means to serve Jesus, the hard-working disciple maker is not the person that has all the answers, is perfect, or is producing more than everybody else. It is the person that's taking what they know and they are working hard to invest it in the lives of other people for the glory of Jesus and out of love for that person. The second thing about the hardworking farmer is to remember that at the end of the day, the production is all about what God does. Meaning that the farmer is largely an investor. Okay, a farmer is not a factory worker where they are churning out widgets. Now, hopefully, if a farmer plants a field of corn, hopefully there's more corn kernels that come out of that field than went into it. And then here again, we get back to this idea of an investor. They are someone who takes a little bit, and hopefully over time, a whole lot grows from that. So a couple of things about farming and about disciple making is this. Investing always involves giving away something. So a farmer takes this little piece of kernel, or this little piece of corn kernel, and he plants it into the ground. Now, for all intent and purposes, for all he knows, that corn kernel went into the ground and it died. And in a way, that corn kernel has to die in order to give life to the plant, which is then going to produce not just one kernel, but maybe hundreds of kernels of corn. So a farmer is not a producer of widgets. A farmer is an investor. He takes a little bit, he gives himself to it, he expends tremendous amount of effort cultivating a right environment. But at the end of the day, only God is the one that brings about the production. What will a farmer do? Well, a farmer will do many things He'll tend the fence. He'll feed the animals. He paints the barn. He builds the silo. He lays the drainage tile. He does a lot of things that seemingly don't, at first blush, have a lot to do with putting that piece of corn in the ground. But all of that creates an environment of growth and health that would lead to production. What is a disciple maker going to do? A Christian who is on mission may do many things. They may go over and help somebody change a light bulb in their home. They may go over and give somebody counsel on how to sew a certain style of stitch. They may be someone who goes over and talks to their neighbor about something that's going into the community, and they use their gift of gab. And we might say, at first blush, we say, well, these aren't gospel-centered activities, but they are. Because just like that farmer is laying drainage tile, and just like that farmer is building silos, he's creating an environment that is going to lead to the growth of that plant. You and I can use everything that we have, from natural abilities to personalities, to our relationships, to our platforms, to our influence, to build into the lives of people that we may have gospel conversations leading people to faith in Jesus, and then helping people who are already saved grow in their likeness of Jesus. And then take that and go back and then have gospel conversations with others. So you and I, okay, it's not just a matter of planting the field in springtime. We have a lot of opportunities to use the natural things and the supernatural things that God has given to us. Lots of prep work takes a lot of prep work to take something guaranteed like this little kernel of corn and then lay it in the dirt, hoping that the Lord will breathe on it and grow a disciple or convert somebody to faith in Jesus. So the farmer is by very nature not a producer. Technically, he's an investor. He takes what God's already given, he commits it to the ground, he plants it, he waters it, but he knows that God's going to give the harvest. So the effort is not in the production. The harvest is in the building of relationships with other people through whatever means that God has given to us, so that we may have redemptive conversations leading people to Christ or leading people into a more faithful witness or follow of Christ. So here's what it takes, really. It takes a couple of things. In 1 Corinthians 9:6, we see two aspects of the great harvest principle. Number one, the more you plant, the more you sow. The more you plant, the more you put into the ground, the greater likelihood is that there's going to be more of a harvest down the road. Meaning, the more gospel conversations that you and I have, the more people that we will have an opportunity to lead to Jesus. We might have 100 redemptive conversations with people and no one comes to faith in Christ. But if we don't have 100 conversations with people, then there's guaranteed through our witness, nobody's coming to Christ. You get what I mean? So the more we plant, the more we sow, the more we plant, the more we harvest. You say, Matt, I've tried to ask people to have a Bible study with me, but nobody wants to have a Bible study with me. Well, how many people have you asked? Well, I asked a handful. Well, could you imagine a farmer says, you know what, I just didn't have a great harvest this year. And Mike Hoover says, well, how many acres did you plant? Oh, I didn't plant acres. I planted a couple feet. So you planted a couple of feet, we're wondering why you didn't get thousands of acres? Well, I was busy, or I didn't think about it. So I just want to challenge you, not everybody that you talk to about Jesus, not every kernel that the farmer plants leads to an investment, but the more we plant, the more we sow. The other aspect of the great harvest principle, 1 Corinthians 9:6, is that no one plants and harvests in the same season. Could you imagine Mark Ross goes out in May and he plants a field? On May 15th, he plants a field. On May 16th, he goes back out to the same field and he goes, I'm going to give up. This is stupid. These plants never grow. We would say, well, Mark, corn doesn't grow overnight. In fact, maybe he'd probably say that to me with my backyard garden. Matt, you're going to have to wait and be patient. The same is true with disciple making. You and I really don't know who's going to respond, when they're going to respond, how they're going to respond. You don't plant and harvest in the same season. Parenting is like this. Man, you start here, years go by, and all of a sudden you begin to see a little change. And the same may be true with your unsaved neighbor, your unsaved kid, your unsaved spouse, your unsaved friend at work. It can also be true with that person that you know is a Christian who doesn't seem to have any interest in Bible study, that doesn't have any interest in watching their language or really sacrificing their life for Christ. But listen, you and I are not responsible, remember, for the harvest. We're only responsible for the sowing. So don't give up and don't be encouraged if you talk to 5 or 6 people and nobody responds. Number one, we just don't know how that's going to work out. We have to stay at it. And that's what a farmer does. Mark Ross has said things like this. Mike Hoover has said things like this. How's it going this year? Not good. Not good. And it seems like that's been the answer the last 4 or 5 years. How's the harvest this year? Well, it's really down. Markets are really bad. And then something changes, right? Something happens. God provides. And the same is true when we're talking about making disciples. So there's a need for a great amount of patience. Listen, James 5:7 says this. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until it gets to the early and late rains. Farmers often talk about $1 million rain in July and August. But man, there's a lot of time between planting and harvesting. Don't give up. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:15, he says, but by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace towards me did not prove vain, but I labored, same word here as in hardworking farmer, but I worked hard, even more than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God with me. What's Paul saying? Paul's saying this, man, I worked hard to plant gospel seeds. I worked hard to the point of exhaustion to invest my life into men like Timothy. But you know what? At the end, it really wasn't what I did. It was about how God breathed on it and brought it about. So I've heard someone say this once, and I think it's true. Work like it all depends on you. Sleep and rest like it all depends on God. And I think that's a true statement because it just emphasizes who's ultimately responsible, but who's responsible too, that it is a partnership between us and God to do disciple making. Last thought about this before we move on to the sharing of the first crops. Sometimes when we talk about revival in America, we say there just aren't people being saved in America like elsewhere. And maybe God's not working in the hearts of Americans like he's working in the hearts of people trapped under communism in China. But there's also an alternate explanation of that. It just might be that you and I aren't sowing a lot of gospel conversations. What Paul says is I labored, but God gave the grace. I want to challenge you as we think about this season. Lots of things to get caught up with, right? Lots of distractions, both missing the big picture and getting caught up in the details of what's online and what's in the news. But your mission and my mission hasn't changed. Sow seeds of gospel conversations, build redemptive relationships where we can help people who know Jesus, follow Jesus, and encourage those people to begin to witness as well. The more that is done, the greater the potential harvest is. Whew, that excites me. So the first thing is that what does it take to be a disciple maker? Well, what does it take to be a farmer? It takes hard work. And we all know that farmers are hardworking people. I want you to notice the second thing here. And this, I think, is tender and sweet of Paul to include, especially to Timothy, who is disheartened and distracted. He says then, it is the hardworking farmer who ought to have the first share of the crops. What does it mean to have the first share of the crops? Well, in 1 Corinthians 3:5, he says, I planted, Apollos watered, God gives the harvest, or God produces the crops. What are we talking about here in disciple making? What is the harvest of disciple making? We would say it's people who are following Jesus and making disciples. So think of it this way. What God is saying is, just like the farmer gets to be the first person to enjoy what he harvests. Now, I don't know how harvesting field corn or soybeans could bring joy, but imagine if you were a vegetable farmer or you picked oranges. You would almost seemingly have unlimited joy of being the person who enjoys that first. I think of Liz Hoover and her garden that she produces every year, or the Matthewses, or the Westfalls, and I'm sure the Miracles too. They get to be the people. They give a bunch of it away, but they're the people that get to enjoy it first, and maybe because of all the hard work, most. Now, I think this is an amazing thing about disciple making. There is a joy that God produces when we make disciples. When we have gospel conversations and we see people beginning to get it, it is energizing and it is exciting. It inflames the heart, and it brings tears to the eyes when you begin to see people begin to respond to gospel conversations. Or you work with that young believer in the faith and you begin to see them get it. Or they come to you for counsel and I never thought of that. And then you hear the story about how they went back to their family and they changed that, and it began to produce fruit in their family's life. I'm going to tell you something. It is the best part of pastoring. But it's not the best part of pastoring because pastoring's awesome, and it is, well, sometimes, most of the time. It is exciting because making disciples is what we were saved and built to do. It's what the Spirit wants to do, and I think it's what the Spirit yearns to do, to see God's family expand by one-on-one conversations with other people. Listen to what Hendrickson says. He says this in referencing this metaphor of the farmer. He says, not only will his own faith be strengthened, and that's true. When you're discipling, your faith is strengthened. But his hope is quickened, his love is deepened, and the flame of his gift is enlivened, so that he will be blessed in all of his doing. There is a firing up, there is a revival in the heart when we take those first steps of making disciples. We are the ones that get to participate in the first fruit of people that begin to follow Jesus, the joy and happiness of disciple making. We get to share in it first. The first steps of pride, the first steps of joy, the first steps of happiness. So what does it take to be a disciple maker? It takes hard work. It takes a lot of work. It doesn't mean that we quit our job. It doesn't mean that we quit our family, but it means in our job and in our family, we work hard to take advantage of the opportunities to have redemptive, gospel-centered conversations. We invite people into our lives, and that's hard. It takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. We do this. Why? Because this is what God's called us to. It is hard work. If you've ever worked with people, you know it is hard, maddening work. But it's worth it. One of the reasons why it's worth it is just like the soldier does what he does to please the one who enlisted him, we get to please Jesus through disciple making. The second thing we get to do is we get to reap the reward, right? Just like the athlete. The soldier works hard to please the commander. The athlete runs hard to gain the reward. The well done, thou good and faithful servant. And the farmer, he works hard to experience the joy and the beauty of seeing other people get it. Because here's the thing. Other people aren't going to get it if the disciple maker isn't making disciples. You say, well, God can do it apart from disciple makers. Yes, but it is God's plan A to use people to invest in other people. My challenge for you today would begin to ask the question, who has God laid on my heart, that one person in my life that doesn't know Jesus? Would you begin to pray for them? Pray for an opportunity. Pray that we wouldn't chicken out from that opportunity to talk to them about the gospel. And maybe the other question is, what is that one person in my life that shows an interest, a Christian who shows an interest in growing spiritually? Or have I even asked that one person if they would like to join me in growing spiritually? Would you not think about, if the Spirit's impressing it on your life, would you work hard to build a contact with them and invite them into a weekly meeting with you? You say, Matt, I just don't know that I have the time. What I'm going to say to you today is this. You won't please the commander. You won't gain the reward. And you won't experience the full joy of what it means to follow Christ if you're not a part of making disciples. So what do we do in this time of uncertainty? We do the same thing that we were doing or should have been doing in times of certainty. We are moving forward to make disciples of Jesus Christ. Blessings to you. I'm praying for you. And if you have any questions about how to do this, or you need any resources, you call me. This is the greatest call you could make. And it's the one I would most love to receive. I love you. I'm praying for you.